Okay. Oh, microphone. All right. All right. I think I am. There we go. Okay. Perfect. Nice. Someone drew on the screen. That's how rude. That's so rude. Okay, how am I doing today? I am good. It is Friday, and Friday's great. Do I like Drake's music? No, not especially. It's just not. I'm sorry. I'm sort of. This probably sounds right. I'm more of like a honestly classical music kind of person. Weird like that. I'm doing good. It's Friday. Good times. All right. Where is the live recording link? It is on eClass. I showed last time. If I have time at the end, I will show you. It's on eClass. It says recorded lectures playlist. But you can always follow that to the YouTube channel and click on the live tab, and anything that I've failed to put up will be there. Okay. Okay, cool. Very quick questions. 3 major schools are functionalism, conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism with a bunch of sub-schools. So that was easy. The slide was suspended for post-structuralism. Can I get a small recap? Yeah, post-structuralism basically wants to break down binaries because they think that anytime you try to define something, it is basically a way of controlling people and exercising power. And sometimes you do that by defining certain groups out of existence. Okay, and then which philosopher, that was a very brief recap. Which philosopher names are you responsible for? Think basically the big ones, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, right? I will go out of my way not to ask any questions that ask you about the specific thoughts outside of Marx, Durkheim, Weber, right? Because I know there's a lot of names. Okay, I guess slightly like Merton, right? But here you're not going to be really responsible for Merton. I would give you Merton's kind of sociological theory. I'll be asking you though specifically about like latent and manifest functions, and the question will be oriented towards latent and manifest function. So you could have how inappropriate. Goodbye. All right. Yeah. So I mean, I will always kind of give you as much as possible, like the concept, and ask you to like sort of explain it. Or hey, this is people find their husband or wife when they're attending university. This is an example of Merton's concept of, rather than like you have to tell me something about Merton, right? I wouldn't be like, this is an example of who's thinking, Merton, Smerton, Turton, Foucault, I don't like those kinds of questions because they're meant sort of to screw you up. And I'd rather you understand the concepts than remember who Robert Merton was, because, that's not as important at this level. So what is the difference between microsociology and macrosociology? I mean, it's not terms that I honestly hear thrown around a lot, but microsociology would be more like at the level of personal relationships, and macrosociology would be looking more at the level of institutions. Okay, off we go. Yeah, please.
So then would microsociology be like pretty much the same thing as psychology in that sense?
I think you'd be looking more at the social relations between people rather than, like, psychology is more worried about individuals and kind of people's individuals kind of mental states and how that affects their lives. So I mean, it's how should we say, a pseudoscience? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Oh, I don't know. I think I told a different. I don't know if I told this class. My first experience of psychology was Psych 104, where literally the instructor was a grad student who admitted that she was a like a sex addict, so that she would tell us at the beginning of every class about her sexual escapades, and it scarred me on psychology after that, right? So, and like every time she's like, I met this guy at a bar. It's like, oh God, the class is starting. Like, this is not going to go. And it was pretty explicit. Like, she went into some detail. It was very traumatic. Okay. I will not do that, I promise, because no. Okay, so we were talking last time. Let's go back one slide. We're getting into our talk on symbolic interactionism, right? So symbolic interactionism is our third big school, most commonly associated with Max Weber, right? Okay, so I know we've seen Max Weber and we talked about him in terms of conflict theory, but symbolic interactionism is most commonly associated with Weber. And again, just to kind of recap really quickly, mostly interested in a couple of things, right? Interpersonal communication, the micro level of social settings, right? So interpersonal, and really interested in how people interpret through language, their own social reality, right? So how people basically build their understanding of the world and therefore how they act through their interpretation of the world. Okay. I know, it's ridiculous. I asked if they could move us rooms. They said no. I'm like, it's like 400 degrees in this room. And they're like, that's the right temperature. Because other rooms are 4 degrees, we have to heat this room up so that some of that heat moves. No, they didn't give me a reason. They just said there's no space on campus. Because half the campus is falling apart, right? ECA's done, the breezeway is done, and like everything's, and humanities is like waiting for demolition at this point, I think. So yeah, we're out. Okay, so symbolic interactionism, right? Really focused on understanding people's motives and the meaning that they attach to things, right? In order to better understand the significance of their actions, right? So it really is like, okay, people as social agents basically look at the world. Now, some of what they know about the world is taught to them through socialization, right? Through what they were taught by their parents, by school, by religion, by society, by the media, by whatever, right? And how they interact with those things and make meaning out of them and guide their actions through them is what symbolic interactionism is really interested in, right? What makes their actions really interesting is precisely that. So probably one of the first examples of this is found in Max Weber's book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And basically, and I'll play a little video for you in a sec that kind of sums it up. But basically, what Weber said was that following the Protestant Reformation, right? So in 1517, on Halloween, October 31st, 1517, there's this monumental event in Western history called the Protestant Reformation, right? It starts with Martin Luther nailing 95 Theses to the cathedral door in Wittenberg, but then kind of spirals to a split between Catholics and Protestants, those who want to follow the Pope and those who don't. And have different interpretations. And you get all sorts of theological innovations, right? Different ways of understanding the world based on how you understand the Bible and who Jesus was and all of that. And what Weber says is basically one of these, right? So it's a school of thought in Christianity or denomination that's founded by a fellow named John Calvin, right? Who I believe is Swiss. And Calvin has this particular notion of how you get to go to heaven, right? How you get salvation. And his notion is that it's all predestined, right? God knew before the world was created, and because God exists outside of time, who is going to heaven and who is going to hell. So he splits people into the elect and the damned. The elect get to go to heaven, and the damned don't. Now, what interests Weber about this specifically is the notion that based on that understanding, it changes people's social actions, right? That they start to do things differently. And very specifically, he says that because they believe that none of your kind of personal actions are going to get you to heaven, you're either elect or you're not, and they're worried because frankly, no one wants to go to the bad place, everyone wants to go to the good place. Ultimately, they start to try and prove that they are on, the list to go to heaven. And part of this is, they try to succeed, they try to contribute to their communities, and they try to, basically invest, build, worldly success to show that they're blessed by God, right? And so this devolves into what Weber calls the Protestant work ethic, right? Where basically they live simple lives, they live frugally, they save money, they don't live ostentatiously, what he calls asceticism, right? Living a kind of pared down and stripped down life in order to prove, and then they get hopefully worldly success in order to prove that they are in fact one of the elect, the people going to heaven. Now, according to Weber, what this does is it sort of spurs the early growth of capitalism, right? Because, with all of this excess money that they're saving by living simple lives, they reinvest that in their businesses, which gives seed capital to, a burgeoning industry in places like England and in places like the Netherlands, both of whom have these really strong Calvinist religious denominations. Okay, so this is the kind of notion, right? Based on how people interpreted the notion of salvation and how you get it, their actions changed, right? So how they were presented with the idea of salvation changed the way they acted and caused, for Weber, a world historical change, right? The rise of industrial capitalism in the Netherlands, but more importantly, in Britain. All right, I got a little BBC video that kind of explains it. Or summarizes it.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built up businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own. But according to Weber at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.
Okay, before I jump into that, I will say, for the record, pretty well understood at this point that, well, this idea is really influential, and I think there's a lot to this idea that comes from Weber that, the way we interpret the world ultimately shapes how we react to it, and therefore our actions, and it can reshape society in major ways. I think this is pretty well understood, and I think there's a lot of foundation to it. However, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, this theory that Weber has, that basically, it was Calvinism that eventually led to capitalism. I think we have pretty good historical reasons to think that he gets that wrong, right? That he actually has misunderstood the history, and he's not a very good historian. And another really famous sociologist from the 20th century, a guy by the name of Rodney Stark. I like to call him the honey badger of sociology because he don't take no shit. He just takes what he wants, and he's a vicious kind of person. But brilliant at the same time, suggested that Weber's Protestant ethic and the history that Weber lays out is an idea so stupid that only sociologists still believe it, which I kind of agree with, and I always lobby my colleagues who teach classical social theory to stop teaching Weber's Protestant ethic, because he got the history wrong. We know that the kind of proto forms of capitalism are actually really deeply in European history and go back to the 11th century. Especially in Catholic monasteries and city-states in Italy, where they invented things like brokerage and double entry bookkeeping and credit in the way that you do it, credit without actually transporting big chests of money, right? All of this emerges not from Protestant Northern Europe, but actually from Catholic Italy. So, yeah, it's always nice if people are quiet so everybody can hear. So, Weber's kind of wrong about the history. But nevertheless, this idea remains really influential, and people have taken this kind of general idea and built theories on it that I think stand up despite Weber being wrong. Did Weber hate religion? That's an interesting question. I think what's true generally of actually Durkheim, Marx, and Weber is that they all, viewed religion fundamentally as false, right? They viewed it as fundamentally not a true picture of the world, and they kind of vary in terms of how they viewed the utility of religion. I think it goes without saying that Marx hated religion, right? Marx, very anti-religious, very famously, he said that European society needed to be baptized in the Feuerbach, which is the Feuerbach, or the fiery stream, but in this case, his mentor, Ludwig Feuerbach, who was an adamant atheist. So I don't know that Weber hates religion. He just views it as false, and he ultimately views it as going away, right? That it's going to give place to a rationalistic, scientific kind of view of the world. And that's just, who's Weber? That guy. That's Weber, Max Weber, German sociologist, middle to late part of the 19th century. That's Max Weber. One of the three founding fathers. You're going to want to learn his name. Okay, so did he hate religion? I don't think so. Again, I think I don't think he opposed the idea of the Protestant ethic. For him, it's a descriptive thing, right? It's like, where does capitalism come from? He thinks it emerges from this Protestant work ethic, right? That the very spirit of capitalism for him, which is why it's called the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, ultimately emerges from a Protestant source, right? So I don't think he opposed it. He's describing what he sees as a historical phenomenon, right? One that really appeared, in the 16th and 17th centuries, right? So a couple centuries before he's writing. Now again, I would say he gets the history wrong. We've known that almost since he published the book, but still influential. Okay, so other symbolic interactionists, right? So you get this fellow, George Herbert Mead, who again, he's a kind of disciple of Weber's and takes this school of thinking, a little bit further than Weber did. Okay, so what does Mead say at the end of the day? Okay, so essentially what he says is that your sense of who you are, right, is formed in your interaction with other people. So, like when people are being socialized, how does this process happen? Well, you learn to do it by interacting with the world, right? So, he has this kind of very, strange sort of way of thinking about it. But he basically says that, when you are learning who you are as a person, right? Mostly when you are a child, although this process in some ways is ongoing as you move through life and as you adopt different roles over time. Basically, when you're interacting with someone, right? Let's say you're a little kid, right? So you're a little kid and you do something, you take some kind of action. You're basically judging who you are by the way people react to you, right? And so this is kind of one of the key ideas behind, certain kind of schools of parenting, right? That if a child is doing something good, you should give them a lot of positive attention, right? And then they're going to learn that they're good, right? That they're fundamentally good. But if a young person hears all the time that they're bad, they're bad, they're bad, they're bad, they're bad, they're bad, they're going to start to think that they are somehow bad, right? And basically, that's Mead's ideas. Like, we're taking on the role of the other person. So when I do something, right, I build something with Lego as a kid, and I see then how people react to it. If people are like, oh, that's what a wonderful thing, you're so smart, I start to be like, I'm so smart, right? Because that's what other people are saying. I see myself through their interaction with me. If I, throw something down the stairs and break it, and they're like, you're such a bad boy, and this gets repeated over and over, you start to see yourself as bad, right? Now that's a little bit simplistic as an example, but it's basically it, right? And so, like, when you are treated by a teacher in school, right, as super competent, right, and you're smart, you will start to think that you're smart, and you'll start to try harder and possibly achieve more. And there's been some really interesting sociological experiments that have been done along these lines, right? So there's one very famous study where basically the researchers came into a bunch of classrooms and gave kids IQ tests, right? So they gave kids IQ tests, And basically, they gave fake results to the teacher. Like they had their real IQ tests, but they kept the real results to themselves, and they gave fake results to the teachers that were randomized. So they randomly assigned a bunch of kids in particular classes to say they were gifted. And then they assigned a random selection of kids in those classes to say they were not gifted. And they had control groups and all this other stuff. And basically, what they found was that when they told a teacher that a student was gifted, that teacher tended to give that student extra attention. So even if the student had an average IQ test and an average IQ, when they came back 8 months later and administered a second IQ test, they found all sorts of things. That child had more self-confidence. Why? Because they were being treated by the teacher as though they were gifted. So they got extra attention, they got extra help. The teacher showed that they believed in them and their potential, and they started to internalize that as well. They started to see through that teacher's eyes, right? And their IQ tests went up because, being given extra attention helped them along, which made them, people praised them more, which made them feel more kind of special and competent and capable. And then when that didn't happen, right, people stayed where they were. So we react to how people treat us, how people talk to us in particular ways. And we'll learn, like if you teach people that they are super special, a unique snowflake in the whole world, they're going to start to reflect that. And we see this even in generational data, right? I was just reading about this in a book yesterday called Generations by a fabulous researcher named Jean Twenge. And she said this is how the early millennials were treated, right? They were treated as everybody told them they were super special, super smart, the most gifted, super competent, and the best at everything. And when they went out into the world, they thought that they were all of those things. And many of us had a rude awakening when we realized we were actually not as good as we were told by our parents we were, and Sesame Street, and all of those other insidious things. Thanks a lot, Big Bird. Okay, so that's a long way of explaining Mead's theorem. Okay, so Erving Goffman. So here we're talking about an American, right? Again, someone following in this symbolic interactionist kind of lineage and taking it a step further. And what Goffman said, that people basically, he compares life to a stage play, right? I don't know, you got a little Shakespeare here maybe, life is but a walking shadow, a poor player who struts and frets his hour upon the stage, right? That's sort of what Goffman is saying in a sense. It's a little bit of Macbeth for you. I guess there was some benefit to my high school English teacher getting us to memorize a bunch of Shakespeare lines, right? So basically what he says is that everything we do is a kind of staged play, right? In a sense where we are moving through life and trying to put our best foot forward so that people react in the best possible way to us, right? And he says basically, social interaction is kind of like a carefully staged play, complete with the front stage, the back stage, defined roles and a wide range of props, right? So we're all acting roles as we move through life. And we, amongst other things, right, we pick up different roles at different points, right? And in different social settings, you're going to be, in a different role, right? So when you leave here and you go home, right, you're going to have probably a certain affect, like a certain way of being with your peers, right, and with your classmates. If you come and talk to me, you're going to go and act a certain way because you're in a certain staged role. Like right now you've been cast as student number 4, and you're going to act like student number 4. When you go home, right, and now you're in the domestic sphere with your parents, your affect sort of changes, right? You change the way you behave. Depending on who you are, you'll talk to your parents in a different way than you would talk to me, and your friends and all of these sorts of things, right? And then when you go off to work, you have a different kind of way of being because you're taking on a bunch of roles as you move through your day and sort of, doing things in a particular way. And I've always noticed this for myself as well, right? Like it's a funny story because when I used to teach a class for engineers, oh God, the trauma. No, they're wonderful. They're very hard to fool with multiple choice questions because they're very good at studying. So I had to write really hard multiple choice questions for them. Thank God I've toned it down for this class. But one of the things that happened, I brought one of my friends in who's an engineer, and he used to run an engineering firm a few years ago to talk to them and basically, give them a change of pace from just my voice. And I kind of started because I had a few concepts I needed to go over before he talked to it. And I sort of went into this mode that as you see me now, right? I had a very particular affect. And after class, he was like, dude, that was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, you, when you're up there talking to your students, that is not you. And I'm like, no, that's me, pretty sure. I didn't have a dissociative state, right? I'm pretty sure I was physically there because I remember it. He's like, yeah, but you act so different, right? And again, this is kind of what Goffman's talking about, right? When I'm in front of students and when I'm talking to students, I have a certain mode that I click into, right? And I'm not even really conscious of it. And I'm sure you find this as well. Like when you're working at your job, you just kind of click into a different way of being. You act a little bit differently than you normally would. Like if you come to my house, which you never will, sorry. But if you came to my house and saw me like with my kids and with my wife, very different kind of way of being, right? Not so official. I'm not lecturing at you. I tell jokes much more or much less. I don't remember which anymore. But I have a different kind of affect because I'm playing a role here in front of you, right? I'm playing the role of the professor, and I have a certain way of doing that, right? And I have my props. Huh? The tea tumbler is sort of necessary because I need it to not die. But right, there's certain things that we do and certain ways that we are. And I have a certain costume in a sense. And that's what kind of Goffman's getting at is, there's certain kind of ways we move through life that's a lot like a stage play. And we're interacting with our expectation of those places to try and seem the best, right? To put our best foot forward. Like I always have this thing, right? And this is my symbolic interactionism. My dad always told me, when you get into a professional kind of situation, you have to wear a shirt with buttons. This is my dad's thing. And to this day, like I've tried to wear like t-shirts and like a jacket on top of t-shirts and sweaters, and it just rubs me the wrong way because the way I'm interacting with my own socialization, it's like, dude, where are your buttons, right? So that's kind of what Goffman is getting at. All right, I should see if there's any questions here. Okay. Yeah, I believe Mead and Weber, I want to say Mead studied under Weber or knew him. But I can't remember off the top. Okay, I'm going to ignore these questions because, real questions only, please. Is that study considered ethical? So that study did, in fact, get past research ethics. So for lots and lots of reasons, right? There's no real harm being done. Right? In essence, the kids that were not helped by a particular teacher were not made to feel any worse about themselves. They were just made to feel, like they were before. So it was only the teachers that were told the results. So it's only the teachers that changed their behavior. It wasn't like, oh, little Timmy, you're average. Oh, little Johnny, you're above average. It was just to see how teachers reacted to students in particular. So it was considered ethical, and it showed us, right? They called this the Spurter study. They said that those who make the most advances are often the ones that are given the most attention from the teacher, right? So that one actually did pass ethics. Oh, there's a place called Manville, Alberta, and apparently Goffman's from there. Okay. Okay, okay. So basically people self-actualize via their interactions, reflecting what they're told about themselves by copying those around them. Yeah, and reflecting back those interactions. Perfect. That's a good way of doing it. What would I say is the real version of a person then? I mean, I'm sorry. Huh. What a strange and odd question. I have no idea. I know Rodney Stark was like 6'4", only because he apparently, when he was in North Dakota, he used to sneak across the Canadian border and play for the Calgary Stampeders. I don't know why I know that, but I do. Okay, well, this is the real version of a person then. This is a weird psychology question. I don't know that there is a real version of a person or something that you are at your core, right? Your essence. It's a weird like ghost in the machine kind of argument, like. And like a Cartesian, like what's the real person, the cogito of the person. So I'm just going to skirt this question because I have no idea. And sociologically, right, you're just always being constituted by the people you're around. So I'm going to skirt the question. Yeah, please.
Well, then let's say you're not around anyone. If you are by yourself, would that technically count as a real version of you?
I don't know, right? But even then, you would still be reacting to the way you were socialized, right? Like you would still be shaped by your expectation. Like I don't know, like if you suddenly find yourself on a desert island, you would still probably be shaped by the social expectations you had going in of what do I do when I'm on a desert island, right? Befriend a volleyball, you know, use skates to extract my own teeth and all of that kind of fun stuff. Okay, obviously a very, very pop culture reference there. Okay, can I compare Goffman's idea to social desirability bias? Social desirability bias, as I understand it, is more, you know, something that we have, especially when we're asking particular questions in sociological research, that we're worried that instead of answering honestly, people will answer the way they think they want, either what's socially expected or the way the researcher wants them to answer, right? So for example, with social desirability bias, one of the big problems we have, say with questions about religious service attendance, is that people typically feel like they should attend religious services more because it's, you know, generally historically been seen as a good thing to do to go to church or mosque or synagogue or whatever. And so we always think that when we see a number like, 30% of Americans say they attend religious services every week, we know there's some like people think they should, so they answer that question dishonestly. And very interestingly, there was a study that I saw recently. Now this one I think is super unethical, where basically someone bought a tranche of cell phone data, right? So like, you know how the cell phone tracks everywhere you go. And there's companies that kind of anonymize it and then sell it. And they looked through the data and they checked like on Sunday morning to see if 25% of people in a particular locality were actually going to church on Sunday morning like they said they did. And I think, you know, well, it's like 25% of people reported religious service attendance on a weekly basis. In the tranches of cell phone data, he said the number was actually more like 3. Because people, he said, were basically lying through their teeth on surveys. Now, again, I think there's problems with that methodology, not the least of which is it's super unethical to like steal people's personal data. But, you know, I think Goffman's idea is more like you react to how other people react to you, and you're not doing it at a conscious level. Social desirability bias is a little bit more conscious. Okay, and it more relates to research. Okay, so social constructionism, you know, so now I think you can hardly go a day in our society without hearing someone say that something is socially constructed, right? And this is basically from this school, you know, symbolic interactionism, and its sub-school, social constructionism. Now, I mean, social constructionism mostly comes from, I guess I can write it down. The writing on the screen tends to look ugly, and my pen's not working. Oh, no, it does. But it's just a lag. No, I've now changed slides. Peter Berger. Wow, that looks really bad when I can't see what I'm writing. Okay, so Peter Berger. Peter Berger is probably the originator of this idea of social construction or social construction of reality. Why? Because in 1962, he writes a book called The Social Construction of Reality. And basically, it is this variant of symbolic interactionism. And basically, it says, right, that when people interact, they typically assume things are naturally or innately what they seem to be, but actually, you know, so like when you go through life, you kind of assume that the way the world is just the way the world is. But a lot of this, you know, a lot of the things that we take as innate is actually kind of a bunch of hidden social processes that construct things the way they are, right? And so like one of the ways that this has been taken up principally has been by like gender studies scholars, right? Who are fundamentally kind of social constructionists at their core, right? Who would say like, that we think of, you know, gender as biologically determined, what social constructionists would say is that a lot of the things that we think of are actually quite arbitrary, and they essentially only exist because they are supported through social systems, right? Why do women tend to wear their hair long and men tend to wear their hair short or not at all? No, I'm kidding. I have no choice. It's either this or nothing. It's nothing or nothing for me. But right, why? It's not because there's anything innately that makes, you know, women's hair need to be long. It's because it's supported by structures of like beauty, understandings of beauty that are socially constructed, and femininity and masculinity and what it means, right? You know, why do women shave their legs and men don't, right? Again, it's a socially constructed thing that, you know, women should do so because it's feminine to have hairless legs, and men shouldn't because it's feminine to have hairless legs and you want to be masculine, right? All of these things are socially constructed. That, you know, you should be, that you should have a religion used to be socially constructed, right? And now it's kind of breaking apart as people's interpretation of reality changes, right? But a lot of things that we take as sort of innate, right? Masculinity, femininity, meaning of race, right? Meaning of ethnicity, all of these things ultimately sort of fall apart outside of a social context, right? So if you took people out of a social context, and they didn't have any memory of the past, race wouldn't be a meaningful category because people wouldn't have all of the social structures around it, right? So that's sort of social construction, right? A lot of the things we think of as natural to being human are actually just supported by social systems. Even things like the family, right? That families should have this form of mom, dad, 2.1 kids and a dog, right? This is really, for social construction, is just something that emerged out of a particular social context. Because if you go to Africa or to China or India, right, the notion of what a family is and how it interacts is going to be a little bit different or a lot different, depending on the social context, because they construct the notion of family in wholly different ways. Oh, it is really hot in here. Oh, yes. Okay. I don't know about that. There's a pretty right-wing speaker coming to campus. I don't know much about her. I've seen the poster saying she's a residential school denier. I think it happens for sure, but I don't know. I'm not an expert on that. I'm going to go with skirt the question. I don't want Ben Shapiro to talk about me, so I'm just going to pretend I didn't hear the question. That's what we're going to do. Okay. There's this professor in Canada, and he said this. Okay, I want that. I don't need any of that stuff. Okay, especially since all this is going to be on YouTube. My Ben Shapiro impression is much worse than my Jordan Peterson impression, by the way. But that just sounds like Kermit the Frog, so. All right. So queer theory. Queer theory is kind of weird in the sense like feminism, queer theory often is a sort of sociological theory that will borrow from other branches of sociology in kind of interesting ways. It has some elements of conflict theory. It has a lot of, especially that cultural turn of conflict theory and post-structuralism. And it has a whole bunch of symbolic interactionism, specifically social constructionism, built in as well, right? Basically, queer theory is a huge field, and I don't want to be reductive. Because this is SOS 100, we kind of have to be. Queer theory does things like, it denies the existence of stable identities, right? It will suggest that stable identities are sort of an illusion that we create for ourselves, that you are one person, one kind of thing. And it says most people are in kind of flux at different points in their life, especially around, sexuality. The other thing that queer theory will say in a very kind of post-structuralist kind of lens is that labeling things like male, female, right, creating this binary, gay, lesbian, or gay, straight, cis and or cisgender, and what, other kinds of genders, by kind of having these kind of strict, or cis and trans, I guess would be the binary there. You create these sorts of yes or no, black and white sort of options. And what queer theory says is you eliminate all of the positions between those two kind of poles, right? So, between cisgender and transgender, queer theorists would say there's a whole spectrum of gender identity in between those things that someone could have, right? I don't want to go through the list of it because it's sort of endless. But someone could be agender or gender fluid or gender queer, all of these sorts of things. And between heterosexual and homosexual, right? Someone could be asexual, pansexual. There's more, I just can't remember them off the top of my head. All of these sorts, and between male and female, right, there is intersex and other things on the gender spectrum. And basically, following a kind of Foucauldian sort of way of understanding it, they'll say that, all of these attempts to break things into these binary labels are really attempts at defining everything else out of power and giving, a certain worldview shape, right? A certain worldview control and domination, right? It'll be, male and female will give, especially will create things like the patriarchy, right? And male control, defining everyone as either heterosexual or homosexual takes out all of the things in between, bisexuality, pansexuality, and all of those things. They all kind of disappear if you create these binaries. So queer theory is really about breaking up the binaries and showing all the space in between those things. Okay, feminism. So I will say this, is apparently this is, I have only seen parts of the Barbie movie. Patriarchy is not a horse. Feminist theory tends to focus on, various aspects of the patriarchy. And again, feminism is one of these schools of kind of sociological thought that'll borrow from a lot of different schools. Now, the most common one that we see, I think, is conflict theory. We see a lot of conflict theory in feminism because it tends to construct kind of the world mostly as a contest between male domination or patriarchy and female subordination, right? So, and wanting to kind of balance these things out. And basically, feminists will say that male domination and female subordination, these things are not fundamental to human reality, right? It's not a biological necessity. It is held up by structures of power and social convention, right? Friedrich Engels, who was one of Marx's close collaborators, went as far, as to say that it was all, and I mean, I think Engels was a bit of a hack, but this is kind of the conflict theory way of looking at it, that basically patriarchy and male domination essentially only emerges from the fact that men own property. He said it comes from capitalism. Men own property and they want to pass on that property to their sons. So they need to control the sexuality of women in that society so that those women are never a threat to them, right? Okay. I'll suggest as well that gender is constructed because of the way we treat boys and girls as children and the way we treat men and women through life, right? That people are kind of taught gender over and over and over again. Starting at birth, they're taught what it means to be male, what it means to be female, and that this is reinforced at every step of the way. So feminists will use the phrase like, everybody is doing gender, right? That they're building these kind of gender norms constantly as people move through life. And yeah, these existing patterns of gender inequality should be changed for the benefit of all members of society, right? That equality between the genders would be the ultimate goal. Okay. All right. Can I do it without laughing? It's not a good thing for me to do a Jordan Peterson impression. It always ends with Ben Shapiro getting mad at me. Okay. Can you make money in gender studies? I don't know. I'm not a gender studies major. All right. This is a kind of BBC video. We'll how long are we here? Just about 2 minutes. So we'll take a quick look at this. And it's just kind of the feminist way of looking at gender really quickly in a nutshell.
Look at this. Look at this. Do you like a dolly? Shall we go for the dolly? There's a good girl. You're a good little girl, aren't you, Sophie? Look, what does this say? Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams. Ooh, look at this, Sophie. Meow, meow. I think she liked that pink dolly the best.
If I were to tell you actually that Sophie is Edward,
Does
that change anything?
I maybe thought, oh, this is a little girl, so I have to give her little girl things.
Hello. 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 Come on.
What's this one? What's that one do? Is that a robot? What about this? You like that one? What does this one do? Oliver. Oliver.
You've gone for, you could say, boy toys for this boy.
Possibly in my subconscious, but for me, I was just going for what was around me, but then perhaps my subconscious was automatically playing a trick on me that I was...
If I tell you that he is actually a girl.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. I suppose it's because of the stereotype.
And then that changed your behaviour
Yes,
towards
it
the
did.
child.
It did.
And your
I
behaviour
can't
was
lie, yeah,
quite
it did.
directive.
1, 2, 3. Beep, 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 beep. Do you want to see my robot?
All right, so that's feminist kind of theory about socialization in a nutshell. All right, we'll leave it there. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend. Stay warm. I think it's supposed to warm up next week. Let me out of here. Yes, discard. Okay. All righty.